Good day. Today, 20th May, is turning into a very big news day in terms of legal matters and legal decisions. Firstly, earlier today, the news came through that Julian Assange has been granted permission to appeal against the decision by the Westminster Magistrates Court to approve the request for his extradition made by the United States. So that extradition is now on hold, and there will be a lengthy hearing in the High Court in which the whole question of whether he should be extradited to the United States or not will be re-examined. The decision to grant Julian Assange permission to appeal arose because the assurances that the United States gave that if extradited to the United States, he would be able to rely on the defenses provided by the First Amendment of the Constitution. Those assurances were judged by the High Court to be inadequate in the face of case law in the United States, which seems to suggest that only American citizens have full First Amendment protection rights. I have not yet read this judgment. I've not even read a summary of what the two judges decided. So I'm going to have to return to this topic in future programs. I'm expecting to do several, but obviously I will be covering this topic also on this channel also. But anyway, I will return to it when I've read the judgment and have a clearer idea of what exactly the reasoning of the High Court in making this decision was. The other big legal decision today, which came through literally a few minutes before I started making this video, is that Karim Khan, KC, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, has now applied to the International Criminal Court for indictments of two Israeli leaders, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. In addition, and inevitably, a string of Hamas leaders, including all the top people of Hamas in Gaza itself, have been indicted as well. And these include Yahya Sinwar, who is the head of Hamas located in Gaza. So this is enormous news. Israeli officials are already complaining about it. It's been the Labour opposition leader, at least the main opposition. I'm not sure whether he is from Labour anymore. Actually, I believe he's not. But anyway, the main opposition leader has said that it is a disaster in Israel, has said it is a disaster. And of course, this is going to have huge global international repercussions. Now, in contrast to the decision of the British court in Assange's case, I have read the statement, the lengthy statement provided by the International Criminal Court setting out the prosecutor's reasons for seeking indictments of Netanyahu and Gallant. And briefly, the key issue, the one that the International Criminal Court has homed in on, is the fact that the Israeli authorities have been using a systematic policy of, as the International Criminal Court puts it, or rather the prosecutor puts it, starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, which is, of course, a war crime contrary to Article 8 of the Rome Statute. Now, the statement then goes on to say that the evidence we have collected, including interviews with survivors and eyewitnesses, authenticated video, photo and audio material, satellite imagery and statements from the alleged perpetrator group, shows that Israel has intentionally and systematically deprived the civilian population in all parts of Gaza of objects indispensable to human survival. This occurred through the imposition of a total siege of Gaza that involved completely closing the three border crossing points, Rafah, Kerem Shalom, and Erez, from October 8, 2023, for extended periods, and then by arbitrarily restricting the transfer of essential supplies, food and medicine through the border crossings after they were reopened. The siege also included cutting off cross-border water pipelines from Israel to Gaza, Gazans' principal source of clean water, for a prolonged period beginning 9th October 2023, and cutting off and hindering electricity supplies from at least 8th October 2023 until today. This took place alongside other attacks on civilians, including those queuing for food, obstruction of aid delivery by humanitarian agencies, and attacks on and killing of aid workers, which forced many agencies to cease or limit their operations in Gaza. My office submits that these acts were committed as part of a common plan of starvation as a method of war and other acts of violence against the Gazan civilian population as a means to 1. Eliminate Hamas, 2. Secure the return of the hostages which Hamas has abducted, and 3. Collectively punish the civilian population of Gaza, whom they perceived as a threat to Israel. The effects of the use of starvation as a method of warfare, together with other attacks and collective punishment against the civilian population of Gaza, are acute, visible, and widely known, and have been confirmed by multiple witnesses interviewed, including local and international medical doctors. They include malnutrition, dehydration, profound suffering, and an increasing number of deaths amongst the civilian population, including babies, other children, and women. Famine is present in some areas of Gaza and is imminent in other areas. Israel, like all states, has a right to take action to defend its population. The right, however, does not absolve Israel or any state of its obligation to comply with international humanitarian law. Notwithstanding any any military goals they may have, the means Israel chose to achieve them in Gaza, namely intentionally causing death, starvation, great suffering, and serious injury to body and health of the civilian population, are criminal. Then the statement goes on to explain that in the chief prosecutor's opinion, the International Criminal Court does have jurisdiction over what has happened because, of course, Palestine is a signatory to the Rome Statute and Gaza falls within the territory of Palestine. And I would add that I've looked at the very impressive roll call of lawyers who participated in making this decision and who were consulted by the chief prosecutor, and I noticed that several of them are very well-known British lawyers, known to me, not personally, I should stress, but known to me by reputation as well as others. So, there we are, an indictment against Netanyahu and Gallant. There's also, as I said, a parallel indictment against the Hamas leaders. They've been indicted in some ways of even more severe crimes than the Israeli officials have been. though starvation, planning mass starvation of a civilian population, is a pretty extreme crime by war crimes standards measures. But the indictment against the Hamas leaders includes a count of the sought indictment against the Hamas leaders includes a count of extermination as a crime against humanity, murder as a crime against humanity, taking hostages as a war crime. And I have repeatedly said in program after program concerning Hamas that whatever justification you may feel Hamas might have had for resisting the Israeli authorities, certainly going into Israeli territory, killing civilians there, as did indeed happen, and above all taking hostages, was an act of terrorism and is a war crime and has led directly to these Hamas leaders being included in this indictment. However, important and significant as the indictment against the Hamas leaders obviously is, it is the indictment of the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister of Israel that are going to attract the world's attention, as of course they should. And I will go back to the point that was made in the comments by the chief prosecutor in his statement, which he's published to the world and which no doubt he will be making to the court itself when it convenes. Over and above all the eyewitness and other evidence that exists, one of the main problems that Israel and its defenders have is these words in this statement of the chief prosecutor. The evidence we have collected includes statements from the alleged perpetrator group. Now, notice, by the way, that this refers to a group. It goes beyond, in other words, Netanyahu and Gallant. If Netanyahu and Gallant are indeed indicted, there is clearly a possibility of further indictments against more Israeli officials as well. But I have been saying again, in program after program, extending for many months now, both in relation to the genocide case, which has been brought by South Africa and other countries to the International Court of Justice, and to the current case that is now apparently about to be launched by the International Criminal Court, that Israeli officials, in this extraordinary rhetoric that they have used, have in effect made the case against themselves. Instead of denying allegations that they were seeking mass reprisals, if you wish, against the entire population of Gaza, they have repeatedly spoken in a way that in effect signals that they had that very intention. And incredibly, they continue to do that even after the International Court of Justice said that on the genocide issue there was clearly a case to answer and that the International Court of Justice would therefore proceed to hear that case, and even after the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to take measures to mitigate the situation in Gaza, orders which the Israeli government ignored. There is a direct line between these statements and that decision and those orders of the International Court of Justice, And these indictments of Netanyahu and Gallant and of other Israeli officials, which this statement from the chief prosecutor tends to point to, there is a direct line from those statements to the situation which we now see. Now, if we now turn to the International Criminal Court, I'm going to say straight away, I think they were deeply unhappy, very reluctant to come to this point at all. They are very conscious indeed of the immense political risks to themselves, and they are also clearly worried about the response of various parties, including obviously the United States, to the fact that they've decided to issue, or at least the prosecutor has decided to apply for these indictments. And you see this in the statement that the prosecutor has issued. He says, for example, this: today's applications are the outcome of an independent and impartial investigation by my office, guided by our obligation to investigate incriminating and exonerating evidence equally. My office has worked painstakingly to separate claims from facts and to soberly present conclusions based on evidence to the pretrial chamber. And then he talks about the impressive panel that he has put together to look at all of this evidence, which he says he has. And he goes on to say, today we once again underline that international law and the laws of armed conflicts apply to all. No foot soldier, no commander, no civilian leader, no one can act with impunity. The independent judges of the International Criminal Court are the sole arbiters as to whether the necessary standard for the issuance of warrants of arrest should be met. Should they grant my applications and issue the requested warrants, I will then work closely with the registrar in all efforts to apprehend the named individuals. I count on all state parties to the Rome Statute to take these applications and the subsequent judicial decision with the same seriousness as they have shown in other situations, meeting their obligations under the statute. I also stand to work with non-state parties in our common pursuit of accountability. So, the International Criminal Court did not want to go there. They are well aware of the risks. They've taken months to make this decision. They convened a special panel of eminent lawyers to vet the decisions that the chief prosecutor, have made. They're fully aware of the risks they run in bringing down upon themselves the wrath of the US authorities and potentially of many of the authorities in Europe also. But they understand too that their entire credibility as an institution is now on the line in a decision which I suspect some of them probably now regret. A year and a half ago, they issued an arrest warrant against Russian President Vladimir Putin on the grounds that he was abducting children from Ukraine. I've discussed that indictment in many places. I've explained why, in my opinion, it is flawed. I read an article recently in the British media which essentially argued the same thing. But whatever you may think of that indictment, and I've made very clear what I think, there is no doubt at all, there is none, that the evidence that was put together against President Putin and the facts of the case that have been made against him are completely dwarfed as by comparison with what has been happening in Gaza and on the occupied territories. And of course, the fact that Palestine, or the Palestinian Authority, are parties to the Rome Statute, which neither Russia nor Ukraine, by the way, are, well, that will have made the problem in many respects, from a legal point of view, for the ICC even worse. If they pressed on with their warrant against Putin and simply looked the other way, as all these things in Gaza and the occupied territories also, by the way, were happening, then their entire global credibility outside the West would have been shot to pieces. Now, they had, therefore, or so they clearly feel, no realistic choice but to go down the route they have done. And by the way, on the topic of the West Bank, it's obviously not directly included in this request for indictments and arrest warrants, but it is mentioned in this statement by the chief prosecutor. I remain deeply concerned about ongoing allegations and emerging evidence of international crimes occurring in Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. Our investigation continues. My office is advancing multiple and interconnected additional lines of inquiry. And he mentions that this will include acts of sexual violence, presumably perpetrated by Hamas, but also in relation to the large-scale bombing that has caused and continues to cause so many civilian deaths, injuries, and suffering in Gaza. But we can see that the West Bank is included as well. So, a disaster for the Israeli government, a disaster for Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant. And I'm going to say it straightforwardly, I think a major blow, perhaps even a disaster, for the Western powers, for the United States, definitely, though at least the US government has been, if only very feebly, trying to distance itself from the actions that Israel has been taking. And, of course, an absolute catastrophe for the German government and for the German political establishment, which has gone out of its way to, in effect, protect Israel and has worked to try to suppress criticism of Israeli actions in Germany. So, a disaster for all of these countries. And, as I said, what made it, from a legal point of view, all but inevitable that this request for indictments and warrants would be made, was these repeated statements by Israeli leaders. Now, I have to finish by saying that, of course, this is all the action of the chief prosecutor. The court itself now has to make a decision. I have to say that I think it is all but inconceivable that the court will not issue these indictments once the prosecutor puts the request to them. If the court refuses to do that, if they go against their own prosecutor after a statement like this, backed by a panel of this cluster of eminent lawyers, well, obviously the prosecutor himself, his credibility with the court will have been destroyed and he'll have to step down. But I think the international credibility of the court will be destroyed also. And I think from that moment, no one will take it seriously or take the judges who make that decision seriously. I have no doubt at all that these indictments will be issued. Now, can I just say this now opens up all sorts of possibilities and questions going forward. can Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant remain in their positions in the face of arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court? Note that neither of them will be able to travel to Europe in future, because if they do, once the indictments are issued, they will be arrested. If they do travel to Europe or to any other country which is a party to the Rome Statute. Of course, the United States is not a party to the Rome Statute, but it might be nonetheless embarrassing for the United States to receive Israeli officials who have been indicted in this way. Just say. Anyway, so there is now a clear question mark over the political survival of Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant. There is a question mark over whether Israel can continue with the policies in the Palestinian territories, and specifically in Rafah, which it has been following. It will no doubt both outrage, but also to some extent put on the back foot Israel's supporters in Congress, who've been threatening to impeach the president over his actually token delay in delivery of weapons to Israel, bombs to Israel. I expect, by the way, another colossal splenetic outburst from Senator Lindsey Graham, coming on top of the utterly bizarre and extraordinary outburst that he made about a week ago. But anyway, there it is. All of these people are going to be massively embarrassed. How it's going to shape events, how it's going to shape the diplomacy in the Middle East, we're going to have to wait and see. What I would also say is that in immediate terms, it's going to put the United States very much on the defensive, even more on the defensive than it has already been in the UN Security Council. The supporters of a ceasefire in the Security Council, China, Russia, the Arab states, the Muslim states, all of them, anyway, they will now be able to say, well, your country, the country that you're protecting, Israel, has committed massive war crimes, is starving the population of Gaza. Obviously, there has to be a ceasefire. And unless you agree, you risk yourselves being seen as party to what the Israelis, the war crimes that the Israelis are committing. So this is an important event, and we will see what comes. But anyway, I'm not going to try and predict events too far going forward. One should take note of the immensity of the moment. I'm going to finish this part of my discussion today briefly by making one further point, which is that Israel has been doing extraordinary things, in my opinion, terrible things, continuously ever since the state was founded. Now, one can argue about the motivations and about the reasons for those things, but that some of the things that were done were terrible. I think anybody who looks at the history of the Middle East objectively will agree. They have been able to do this for decade after decade, and they have become more reckless and more ruthless over time. Sooner or later, it was inevitable, I think, that legal processes would eventually catch up with them. They've now done so. How Israel itself will react, what people in Israel will think, What Israel's supporters in the Jewish community and outside will make of this, well, we'll just have to wait and see. Now, these two big pieces of news, if that wasn't enough, we've had yet another big piece of news today. And this time, it's not judicial news, it's political news. The president of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi, together with his foreign minister, were killed in a helicopter crash in mountains north of Tabriz, the Iranian city of Tabriz. Now, before I get into a discussion of what that means, can I make my own observation, which is my absolute bafflement with the facts of this incident? It seems that President Raisi and his foreign minister were returning from Azerbaijan, where they'd had a very friendly meeting with the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, and they were returning after that meeting to Iran. I should say that Iran has generally had good relations, better relations with Armenia than it has done with Azerbaijan, and this trip by Raisi to Azerbaijan looks like something of a mend fencing visit. The Iranians have been worried that the Azerbaijan might become a base for US and Israeli operations against themselves. It looks as if that worry has been put to rest, and that was presumably one of the major reasons for the visit. But anyway, the Iranian president with his foreign minister left Azerbaijan in a helicopter. We were told it was one of 3 helicopters. The other 2 were carrying the rest of the delegation. It seems nonetheless astonishing to me that 2 high-ranking officials, the president and the foreign minister, were in one and the same helicopter. I've heard reports that this particular helicopter is very old, that it goes back to the time of the Shah of Iran. It's, in other words, an American Bell helicopter imported into Iran in the 1970s. I'm not sure that that is true, but if so, it does make me wonder why Iran would want to trust the life of its president and foreign minister in an aircraft like that. And the aircraft flew into Iran, even over incredibly rugged, mountainous country, even as the weather was starting to deteriorate with fog and mist and all sorts of things. This seems to me to have been high risk to the point of outright negligence. Now, there might be explanations of which I am not familiar. Already there are theories circulating that this might have been some kind of an assassination, though all of the top people, including from what I can tell, the Iranian officials, are now denying that fact. So it does look like an accident, but an accident which, for the moment, seems to me to have happened as a result of gross negligence. And I'm sorry to say that this doesn't completely surprise me. On the one hand, Iran has demonstrated many times over the last decade or so that it is in some respects an extremely efficient, modern country with a strong industrial base, high technology industries, a strong scientific and technological establishment, able to do things which are complex and difficult and to do them well. And it also has a strong diplomatic corps and effective armed forces. And much about the internal administration of Iran is said to be very efficient as well. Yet, alongside all of that, there's always elements of chaos and dysfunction that seem to coexist with this somewhat orderly picture in Iran, and every so often they float to the surface with consequences like the ones we've just seen. Well, anyway, let's wait and see what the investigation, I assume that there's going to be an investigation of this incident, finally throws up. In the meantime, again, one has to make a few points, discuss briefly what this means. It is important to say that even though Ebrahim Raisi was the elected president of Iran, he was not the leader of Iran. The leader of Iran, to be precise, the supreme leader of Iran, is Grand Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And he, of course, remains securely in place. He is the person who conducts Iran's foreign, defense, and security policies. He is the person who will have decided, been the ultimate decision maker in terms of the response, for example, by Iran to Israel's attack on the embassy building in Damascus. It's his people, Khamenei's people, who maintain the contacts with Iran's various Middle Eastern allies, in the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the militias in Syria and Lebanon, and it is Khamenei ultimately who also determines policy towards Syria and wider Iranian policies towards the outside world. But the president, nonetheless, is a very important official. First of all, he has a very significant role in internal policy. The government that runs Iran's economy and its domestic administration is ultimately responsible to him. And he also plays a significant, if secondary, role in foreign policy, foreign and defense policy. In fact, one can say that the Iranian system, in order for it to work well, needs to work with an elected president who gets on and works harmoniously with the supreme leader. Now, Raisi became president. He was rather a controversial figure with some people when he did. He was characterized as being very much on the conservative end of Iran's policies, which means socially conservative with a strong state interventionist aspect to his policies. More liberal figures in Iran tend to be the opposite. They tend to take a socially more liberal approach, which they ally with a more free market, more liberal approach to the running of the domestic economy. Anyway, Raisi was definitely more on the conservative side of things, but he worked very well with Khamenei, whose views on most things he seems to have shared. He seems to have been an able manager and administrator, and he seems to have been a very successful diplomat. A successful diplomat internally within Iran, in that he seems to have been able to get on with all the major power centers inside Iran and was able to pull them together and make them work in synchrony with each other as a team. And also he was an effective diplomat in terms of Iran's foreign relations, spearheading Iran's move into the BRICS, its negotiations for an arms deal, successful negotiations for an arms deal with Russia, its successful negotiations for a major trade agreement with China, its the settlement of its long-running conflict with Saudi Arabia, all of those various things. And again, probably because Raisi worked well with all the various power centers in Iran and was able to capitalize on these diplomatic successes. He also presided over a significant revival of Iran's economy. During the time he has been in office, Iran's economy has grown rapidly at an annual rate of about 7% a year. Obviously, this has been partly because of the increases in oil prices, but it's also a product of Raisi's effective management of the economy internally and of his success in forging better trade ties with other countries, including, of course, the Gulf states, the BRIC states, and within the BRIC states with China and Russia, and, by the way, recently India as well. So, he was not perhaps exactly a pivotal figure within the Iranian power structure. Iran will continue to function without him. Khamenei is still there. There will be elections soon, and there will be a new president, and a new foreign minister has already been appointed, and the Iranian government will continue. Despite the fact that he was not a pivotal figure, he was nonetheless a very important one, and it will be very difficult, I think, to replace him with someone who brought together his particular set of skills and who will be as effective as Raisi was in stabilizing the domestic situation in Iran and bringing all the various power centers together. Now, there is another factor, which is that the supreme leader himself, Ali Khamenei, is old. He's in his 80s, and he's said to be in far from perfect health. Always one hears reports and rumors about this in connection with anybody in their 80s. Anyway, Khamenei must be coming towards the end of his time as supreme leader. And it's very unclear who his successor is going to be. The supreme leader in Iran is selected through an extremely complex process, which involves, to some extent, or a small extent, the population, who actually do have something of a vote, an indirect vote in the issue, but also the clerical establishment, but also the various power centers that make up Iran. So there have been some suggestions that Raisi himself might have been Khamenei's successor. I don't know, by the way, whether that is true, and I've heard it said that Raisi probably would not have been eligible, supposedly because he lacks the experience and the theological background and the deep knowledge of theology that an Iranian supreme leader is expected to have. Well, that may or may not be the case, but of course, if Khamenei will indeed be leaving the scene at some point over the next few years, then it becomes even more important to have a stable, steady person in overall charge of the government of Iran, able to manage the transition from one supreme leader to another. Now, Raisi fitted that bill perfectly. He was exactly the kind of safe pair of hands that Iran would have needed as it went from Khamenei to whoever his successor is going to be. With Raisi gone, that element of stability has been removed from the system. So we will see how the Iranians deal with all of these many problems that they're now going to face. There's been apparently across Iran a massive outpouring of support for Raisi and grief on the news of his death. He was never perhaps the most popular figure in Iran, though I suspect that over the last year or so, a certain grudging respect will have increased for him, including on the part of some of his detractors. But anyway, there's now been outpouring of grief and support for following his death. That might itself be a stabilizing situation. The establishment is now on the hunt, clearly, for someone to replace Raisi as president. There's going to be elections within 50 days, which, by the way, some people will object is not going to be anywhere near enough for proper opponents to whoever the establishment wants to emerge. That might be the point, by the way. But anyway, all of that is happening, and the Iranian authorities are going to have to work very hard, both to ensure that the situation in Iran remains stable, that Raisi's successful legacy is consolidated, and that the transition, both from Raisi to the next president, and arguably when it comes from Supreme Leader Khamenei to the next Supreme Leader, that all of these transitions are managed well. A pretty tall order and a very demanding set of things for the Iranian government, the Iranian authorities now to have to deal with. And we will see how successfully they do. Anyway, let's now return to the perennial topic of these programs, which is the situation in Ukraine. Now, yesterday I was talking about how with the mobilization law, there were scattered reports about how the cities of Ukraine are becoming deserted. And I said that I had clear information that this was the case with Zaporozhye, but I didn't know how more, I couldn't be sure how more widespread a phenomenon it actually was. Well, we now have a huge amount of reports, apparently lots of film reports from all the Ukrainian cities. And it does indeed seem as if with the entry into force of the mobilization law, they have in effect turned into ghost cities. The men appear to be hiding. The women, to some extent, also are. The streets, therefore, have emptied. There's only a limited amount of traffic. I don't know how long this can continue for, but in itself, even if this only lasts for a few days, it shows how deeply unwelcome the mobilization law for Ukrainians is, how much opposition there is to it across Ukraine, and how demoralized the Ukrainian population has become over the progress of this war, how they no longer really believe that the war any longer can be won, and no longer think that any sacrifice that they make in the war will have any point. And those of us who follow the news from Ukraine closely will have noticed that over the last couple of days, Ukrainian officials, from top to bottom, have again been talking about a Ukrainian offensive. All that has to happen, apparently, is for the Russians to be stopped, for the Russian offensive to be brought to an end, for the situation to be stabilized, and then, supposedly, Ukraine can go on the attack once more and win the war once and for all. Now, I don't know a single objective commentator familiar with the situation on the battlefronts who thinks that there is any reality to these claims. Of course, there are any number of non-objective commentators, people who like to see things not as they actually are, but as they would want them to be, who will tell you otherwise, who will say that, all that's needed is for Ukraine to receive a few more F-16s, 100 or 200 F-16s, 1,000 or 2,000 ATACMS missiles, or whatever it is. And of course, it can then achieve victory. I mean, there are plenty of people like that too. But objective reporters, the people who are at least in some way connected to the actual situation, I don't think any one of them believe that Ukraine is ever going to be able to mount a significant offensive again. Apparently, General Zaluzhny, when he was military chief of Ukraine, told people, I've seen this both in the Western media and on Ukrainian Telegram channels. He said to various people before Ukraine's disastrous counteroffensive of last year that Ukraine only had one shot, that unless it won the war with this offensive, then some form of defeat was ultimately inevitable, given the enormous preponderance of power on the side of the Russians. But all these Ukrainian officials are now going out, fanning out, talking up the prospect of a future offensive. And of course, the reason they're doing that is because they're aware of the growing mood of despair and demoralization across Ukraine. And they're trying to get people's hopes up. They're telling them, look, all will be well. All you need to do is to just go on fighting for a little longer. The Russians will then tire and get exhausted, and then, provided we all do the right thing, which is have all our men join the army, and they're tens of thousands, we will be able to go on to the attack, and the war will be won, and it will all have been for something after all. That sacrifice will be rewarded after all. If you are familiar with the kind of rhetoric that circulated in Germany in the last months and weeks of the war, the Second World War, you will find all this very familiar. Anyway, mobilization, deeply unpopular, and the response of the population reflecting deep demoralization and despair. At the moment, and I have to say this, it's not translating into public protests against President Zelensky and his government on any mass scale. There was the protests by the truckers in Odessa that I spoke about yesterday, the first organized protest by organized labor that I've known about in Ukraine since the start of the special military operation, but I've not heard reports of strikes in any factories. Probably workers are afraid to go on strike because if they're men, they're worried that if they do go on strike, they will themselves be conscripted into the army and sent to fight in the war. So there's probably factors like that holding people back also. But anyway, for the moment, the government remains in control, and I don't really see any sign that there's going to be a mass popular challenge against it. The mood in Ukraine is one of demoralization, of despair, quite possibly, but of fatalism as well. People no longer believing in victory, desperate if they can to get out of Ukraine, but still not prepared to come out onto the streets and to protest against the government, and of course There is no organization in Ukraine which exists which is able to pull them out and bring them onto the streets and to make them do that. Now, it's also the case that as of tomorrow, President Zelensky's constitutional term ends, and he is no longer the elected president of Ukraine. He will purely be president by virtue of the fact that he has extended Ukraine's martial law regime. Now, there's a lot of debate about the constitutional and legal nature of this. I've seen it suggested that the actual provisions of the law mean that martial law only prohibits parliamentary elections being held, not presidential ones, and that what Zelensky is doing is actually illegal. That may be true, but for the record, it is still my view that so long as the United States and the Western powers continue to support Zelensky and wish him to remain in office, he will continue to be in office and will be able to see off any challenges. In other words, for the moment, I don't personally expect anything in the political system in Ukraine to change. The major challenge to Zelensky came last year when he found himself in a conflict with General Zaluzhny. General Zaluzhny, however, was unwilling to act against President Zelensky. Perhaps he knew that the army would not support him, or he knew that the Western powers would be unhappy. So Zelensky was able to dismiss Zaluzhny, and thereafter, Zelensky's position has been more or less secure. None of this changes the overall picture on the battlefronts. And here I think the story is of the Russians continuing to conduct an offensive on a very broad front, right across the front lines, and advancing steadily in every direction. Now, if we start with Kharkiv region, apparently very intense fighting going on in Lipsy. I discussed this at length yesterday, the fact that the Ukrainians, probably on Zelensky's orders, worried about the potential loss of Kharkiv, have over-concentrated troops in Lipsy to prevent a Russian advance towards Kharkiv. But we've now received conclusive proof that the Russians have not only obtained complete control of the whole of Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, but that they have crossed the Volcha River in at least 2 places. It seems that they now control certainly at least half of Volchansk, and it seems that the capture of the city, the remaining part of the town, I should say, rather than city, is now only a matter of time, and probably not that much time. So a major crisis in Volchansk. Now, Volchansk is, in fact, strategically of greater significance in terms of the overall course of the war than Lipsy. Lipsy is important if you plan to get to Kharkiv, but Putin has told us that the Russians have no plan for the moment to capture Kharkiv. It's useful for the Russians to have large numbers of Ukrainian troops there. They can fight them and bomb them and kill them and wound them in large quantities, but they don't need to capture Lipsy because they're not so far advancing to Kharkiv. There is a view that Lipsy is needed in order to prevent Ukrainian troops, the Ukrainians shelling Belgorod from Lipsy. But with an ongoing battle in Lipsy, I can't really imagine the Ukrainians mounting many artillery strikes on Belgorod from there. Volchansk is different. It fits much more closely into the existing battles along the line of contact if the Russians recapture Volchansk and are able to enlarge their bridgehead and push south and east from Volchansk, then it will have a significant impact on the fighting in places like Kupiansk and ultimately Izium and Balakleya, assuming that the Russians really do intend to capture those places. And we've received more news over the course of the last few hours that the Russians might indeed have those plans. First of all, it seems that the Russians have been continuing to press forward towards the Oskol River from the two villages of Kislovka, Kotlerovka, and the other village of Tabayevka that they captured some weeks ago. So there's a renewed Russian advance in the Kupiansk area, but perhaps more importantly, symbolically more importantly, I'm not sure how much it actually changes on the battlefronts, the Russian Defense Ministry this morning has confirmed that the Russians have now fully captured, as the Russian Defense Ministry puts it, have completely liberated Belogorovka, the village in northern Lugansk region, which lies close to the town of Siversk, which the Russians failed to capture in 2022, and which I think unhinged their defenses in northern Donbass and in Kharkiv region on the eve of Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive of 2022. So it looks as if the battle for Siversk is now about to begin in earnest, even as the Russians are pushing towards the Oskol River further north in the Kupiansk area. I discussed in a recent program that the Russians also seem to be resuming their advance towards the Zherebets River in the Liman direction towards Liman. And, well, all of this has been overshadowed by multiple reports of a major battle underway in Chasov Yar. And there are reports that the Russians have crossed the canal in the north and that they've entered the northern parts of Chasov Yar, that they're in the process of capturing or clearing, that they've entered, but that they're now clearing the village of Kalinina to the north of Chasov Yar. And, well, there's lots and lots of film of very fierce fighting happening in the micro-district, which lies to the east of the canal. Now, the micro-district, as I said, is cut off from the rest of the Ukrainian forces. The Russians control all the supply lines, but there are apparently large numbers of Ukrainian troops in the micro-district. It seems that the Russians have captured some buildings within the micro-district. I even saw a report, I think it was this morning, that the Russians now control between a third and a half of the micro-district. There are other reports that say otherwise. The Military Summary Channel this morning said that some pro-Russian reporters or Russian reporters are actually admitting that Russian attacks in the micro-district have been repelled. I've not seen those reports myself, but the Military Summary Channel says they have, and I've no doubt that that is correct. But anyway, there is a massive battle going on in Chasov Yar. The Russians apparently beyond the canal in the north. They have apparently brought Kleshayevka, the village to the southwest of Bakhmut, to the southeast of Chasov Yar, back under their control. They are in a position to cross the canal to the south of Chasov Yar as well, taking Chasov Yar into a pincer. So anyway, a massive battle going on there with the Russians bombing Chasov Yar continuously and inflicting huge amount of damage there. And we're getting really concerning reports from the Ukrainians, from the Avdiivka Ocheretino area. We had reports yesterday that the Russians have cleared the fields between the villages of Arkhangelskoye and Novoalexandrovna to the north of Ocheretino. But it seems that they're also now pushing north from Keramik and east from Ocheretino, gaining control of more territory immediately to the west of the H20 highway. And it looks as if an outflanking movement of the Ukrainian forces in New York and Toretsk is now in its early stages as well. So, very difficult battle for the Ukrainians there. It seems that the Russians have now also gained full control of the road lying between Netalovo and Umanske to the north. These are villages to the west of Avdiivka, both of which the Russians have been besieging and are reported to have captured. That there are some reports that there are Ukrainian holdouts in each of these villages and that the clearing operation in Netalovo and Umanske has still not been fully completed. There are reports that the Russians are now preparing to attack Yasnobrodovka, a village somewhat to the west of this highway also. And, well, there are reports that the Ukrainian garrison bottled up in the northwest of Krasnogorovka, this town to the south of Avdiivka, that they've been sending message after message to Kiev, pleading for permission to withdraw from Krasnogorovka, worried that the roads around them are being closed, complaining about the fact that they're not receiving reinforcements or equipment, and saying that if they remain where they are, they will be trapped, and asking urgently to be allowed to withdraw. We've seen the story play out many times. We saw it in Mariupol, in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, in other places, and it's playing out again in Krasnogorovka. And for the moment at least, Zelensky and Syrskyi, deaf to all these pleas, they insist that the troops in Krasnogorovka must hold on to the last man, presumably. And if they face encirclement, well, so be it. And lastly, reports now that the Russians, who appear to have captured nearly all, or perhaps all of Georgievka, a village to the west of Marinka, which the Russians captured in December and close to Kurakhovo, that the Russians have now also almost completed their clearing operation in the village of Paraskovievka, which lies immediately to the west of Novomikhailivka, which they also captured a few weeks ago. And as I said yesterday, it looks like the net around Kurakhovo and ultimately Vuhledar in the south is closing. And again, one would have thought that with the situation deteriorating in this part of Donbass in the way that it is, a responsible command, short of troops, would be withdrawing Ukrainian troops from Vuhledar, would understand that this territory is about to be lost, and would be consolidating positions where they can be defended rather than allowing troops to remain where they're likely to be trapped. But of course, as I've said many times, that is not what the Ukrainian leadership does. Now, what the Ukrainian leadership is doing is sending ever more desperate messages to the West. We've had Zelensky say that he needs any number of Patriot missile systems, that he needs 2 Patriot missile systems, merely to defend Kharkiv and that he will lose Kharkiv unless he gets them. He says that he needs 120 F-16 fighter jets. Where they're to be based, who is to pilot them, he doesn't really explain. He says that Ukraine needs to be given the green light to launch military strikes deep into Russia. He says that the United States should provide Ukraine with the targeting data so that they can strike at these targets deep inside Russia. He says that he needs advisors to be sent to Ukraine. Advisors, which of course, as Stephen Bryan recently pointed out in Asia Times, what that actually means is special forces troops who will participate in the fighting. Now, and he's following up with even more extraordinary statements. He's just made a further statement in which he says that the West is in effect betraying Ukraine because it doesn't really want Ukraine to win. What the West actually wants is for Russia not to lose and for Ukraine not to lose. And so Ukraine's prospects, possibilities of victory, of achieving a decisive victory, are being sacrificed because of this Western pusillanimous behavior of the West. And of course, not only is Ukraine's prospects of winning as a result evaporating, but the prospects of Ukraine ultimately losing are growing. Now, the problem with that kind of approach is that if you follow it through logically, it means that there is no limit that Zelensky himself will ever reach if he's provided with his 120 F-16s, if he's provided with his countless numbers of ATACMS missiles. There have been more ATACMS strikes, by the way, and the Russian Defense Ministry claims that they've shot down another 10, I believe it was, or is it 9? And they also say that that latest strike was unsuccessful. And by the way, for the record, I have to go back and correct some of the things I said about the apparently successful Ukrainian strike on the Belbek air base a number of days ago. It seems that the S-400 system at Belbek was indeed destroyed, and that was a significant loss for the Russians. But the MiG-31s, the two MiG-31s that were destroyed, they have been standing stationary on the Belbek, in the Belbek air base for months, perhaps even years. They're clearly carcasses of aircraft rather than actual functioning MiG-31s. So it doesn't look as if, apparently the satellite data to confirm this, so it doesn't look as if Russia did in fact lose any actual operating, functional MiG-31s, just saying. But anyway, even if Zelensky gets all the missiles, all the F-16s, all the things that he wants, it still won't be enough to change the outcome of the war, as events have repeatedly shown. Ukraine's manpower problems are insuperable. Ukrainian society is despairing of victory. So where does Zelensky stop making demands? He will, following his own logic, continue to demand ever more weapons, ever more sophisticated weapons, up to and including nuclear weapons, because from his point of view, why would he not? Anyway, in more practical terms, what Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials are trying to do is really very straightforward. They're trying to involve NATO and the United States directly in the war. They're trying to say to the United States, help us to carry out missile strikes on Russia, deep inside Russia, and involve yourself. Be a direct participant in those missile strikes. Have the United States itself conduct missile strikes on Russia. Of course, we don't have enough pilots to fly the F-16s. We know that, you know that, all these 120 F-16s that we're talking about. But you do. You can find all kinds of contractors, operate them for your bases inside NATO, begin an aerial war against the Russians too. Start imposing no-fly zones. And of course, if the Russians shoot down your fighters, well, then retaliate in any way you can against the Russians yourselves. Do all of these things. Go to war on our behalf. Because if you don't, we will lose. And if we lose, well, it will be very bad for you. Now, if it was just Zelensky talking in this way, one could just disregard this. But unfortunately, it's not. There are all sorts of people in the West who would support Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership in these sort of demands. There are people who continue to insist that the West go all out in terms of involving itself in the conflict in Ukraine. Take these paragraphs from an article which appeared yesterday in The Guardian by my old friend Simon Tisdale. NATO should have intervened robustly to deter Russia's aggression right from the start. No-fly zones could have prevented thousands of civilian casualties and limited damage to Ukraine's cities. Restrictions on Kiev's use of Western-made missiles to attack military bases and oil refineries, notice oil refineries as well, inside Russia were and are self-defeating. NATO navies should have imposed defensive cordons around grain-exporting Black Sea ports. How do the NATO navies enter the Black Sea if Turkey, applying the text of the Straits Convention, prohibits them from entering? Tisdale has never actually discussed that. And we're then told that Putin should be told where to shove his contemptible attempts at nuclear blackmail. And NATO should fast-track Ukraine's full membership in July. And the actual discreditable reason why the US is reluctant to do that is because they fear Russian retaliation. And then Simon Tisdale asks rhetorically, does Biden truly believe Putin would attack NATO's 32-country array, a vastly superior force? More likely, cowardly Putin would back off. So we see some people want unlimited escalation as well. They're prepared to give Zelensky everything that he's asking for. And, well, what do they say to those of us who say, you must be joking? What they say is, well, Putin is a coward. Cowardly Putin would back off. What is the evidence that Putin is a coward? What scintilla of evidence exists to suggest that? None that I see. But even more astonishing, those incredible words, more likely Putin would back off. It's the word likely that takes my breath away. Because, of course, what Tisdale and Zelensky and others like them are playing with, are gambling with, is the risk of all-out nuclear war. And they say that it's likely that Putin, who without any evidence, Tisdall says is a coward, would back off. Likely, but obviously not certain. Even Tisdall doesn't know for sure. He's merely guessing. I don't think decisions of this kind should be made on the basis of guesses. Certainly not Simon Tisdall's guesses. But anyway, Zelensky, he wants, as I said, unlimited support from the West, and we see what he's trying to do. And he's going to get at least some of what he wants. General Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has made a bizarre comment, which has appeared in the US media. He's apparently made it fairly clear that he doesn't basically think it's a good idea to send trainers to Ukraine, but he thinks it is inevitable sooner or later that it will happen. An incredible statement from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Either he thinks it's wrong, in which case he should act to prevent it, or he thinks it's the right thing to do, in which case he should support it. It's not for him to say that it's inevitable. It's for him to decide whether it happens or not by giving the proper advice to the president. And if the president won't listen to that advice and starts taking action which General Brown thinks is dangerous, I would argue that General Brown in that case has a duty to report the fact to Congress. But anyway, the trainers sooner or later will be on their way. And of course, they're already there in some number, and they're already fighting in some number, and some of them are already being killed. Of that, there is no doubt at all. The question is not whether escalation is going to continue, because it will. It is how far that escalation will go. I think I remain of the view that on balance, there will come a point where even the most hardline governments in the West, apart from the absolutely fervid ones like the Baltic states, will say it's gone as far as it can. We can't commit further. The Russians are too strong. Their army is too powerful. We can't risk going into Ukraine. We can't risk being defeated in a conventional war against an army more powerful than our own. And we absolutely cannot risk World War III and the consequent nuclear exchange. By the way, in a discussion with Matthew Blackburn and and Glenn Deason, the British historian Jeff Roberts made what I thought was an extremely insightful point. He said that the major factor deterring the Western powers from sending troops to Ukraine is not Russia's enormous nuclear arsenal. It is the fact that they know that the Russian conventional army is far more powerful than their own. So they don't want to go into Ukraine and be defeated, and they don't want to be, I would add nonetheless, in spite of what Jeff Roberts says, or perhaps supplementing what Jeff Roberts says, they don't want to be put in a position where, once they face defeat, they have the impossible choice of whether or not to go all out and risk a nuclear exchange. So I think, in the end, they will back off. But this remains a very dangerous conflict. Indeed, we will see how far it goes. But in the meantime, well, the trends remain the same. The arms package that was passed by Congress a few weeks ago now has obviously changed nothing on the battlefronts, and the Russians continue their advance. So a massive news day, big events happening in many places. I'll return to all this again, no doubt, tomorrow. In the meantime, this is where today's programme ends. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also check out our shop where you can find all the amazing things that there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. Don't forget that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this programme, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.